Hi guys, Maty here from Young One Studio, and I want to push back on one of the most repeated phrases in filmmaking. The gear doesn't matter. You hear it constantly, especially in beginning filmmaking circles and beginning filmmakers and online tutorials. People love to repeat that the best camera is the one you have with you, and the story is everything. And I understand the sentiment behind that statement, because skill, creativity, and vision absolutely do matter. A talented filmmaker can create something interesting with very limited tools. And a great story will always be more important than empty visuals. But let's be honest for a moment. Saying that gear doesn't matter at all is just simply not true. It's a comforting idea, but it ignores the reality of how filmmaking actually works. Think about any other craft, right? No one tells a musician that your instrument doesn't matter. A violinist knows the difference between a cheap student violin and a master instrument. A painter understands that oils, brushes, and canvases affect the texture and depth of their work. A chef knows that a high-quality knife, a brilliant stove, the perfect ingredients, they'll directly influence the final dish. Tools do not replace skill, no, but they absolutely influence what the artist can produce. Filmmaking is no different. If equipment truly didn't matter, the biggest productions in the world would be using an iPhone. They wouldn't invest millions of dollars in cameras and lenses and lighting and sound equipment and post-production systems, but they do. Studios spend enormous resources on these tools because they shape the final results in significant ways. The camera sensor affects dynamic range, color response, how highlights and shadows behave. Lens design influences sharpness and fall off and distortion and characteristics, all the emotional character of the image. Lighting equipment determines how precisely you can sculpt a scene and control contrast and make you feel. Sound equipment determines whether dialogue feels immersive or thin and amateur. Now, these differences are not subtle when you look closely, right? A smartphone, yeah, it can capture an image, but it cannot reproduce the same depth, dynamic range, color fidelity, and texture. Man, it can't even come close to a high-end camera. A budget kit lens behaves very differently from a Cooke, a Leica, an ARRI signature lens. A cheap microphone, it struggles with noise and distance and clarity in ways that a pro shotgun or lav simply won't. It just won't have those issues. A tiny ring light might brighten a face, but it cannot shape light the way a properly controlled cinema fixture can. All of these tools influence how the audience experiences the image and sound. They affect how immersive the world feels, how cinematic the visuals appear, and how they impact you, how effectively the filmmaker's vision translates to the screen for you. Good gear doesn't make you magically great. It doesn't make you a great filmmaker just by having great stuff, but it expands what a very skilled filmmaker can achieve. It gives the artist greater precision, more control, more consistency, that's a big one. Better equipment often allows you to work faster. You can solve problems a lot easier and achieve results that would otherwise be extremely difficult or impossible with lower quality tools. The tools remove certain limitations so the creative decisions can shine more clearly. It's kind of it. When I first started out, I believed very strongly in the idea that gear barely mattered. It felt like a noble philosophy, you know what I mean? Focus on the story, focus on creativity, don't worry about equipment. And that mindset is useful at the beginning, I think, because it encourages you to start creating rather than just waiting for perfect conditions. But the more productions I've worked on, and now I have worked on a lot, the more I realize something important. Better tools genuinely do make a big difference. They make lighting setups more flexible. They make images cleaner, more robust, easier to work with in post-production. They make sound easier to capture properly and work with in post-production. They allow the visual language of film to be expressed with a lot more subtlety and control. None of this replaces storytelling. That's not what I'm saying. A bad story shot in the best camera in the world is still gonna be a bad movie. Craft still matters enormously. Performance matters, direction matters, writing matters, but gear matters as well. It is one of the many components that shape the final result. Pretending that equipment makes not really any difference, it might sound kind of humbling or inspirational, but it just isn't true. The reality is a lot more balanced. story matters, skill matters, craft matters, and yes, the tools you use matter just as much. I want to just double back on something I said about using an iPhone. Anyone who's seen 28 years later, they did use an iPhone 15 sensor to make that film, but it stops about there. Do a bit of research on the lenses they used and the post-production team they had behind creating that film, and you'll still see that they did use an iPhone 15 sensor, and you can see it in the film. It lacks a lot of dynamic range. It lacks a lot in the image, but it served the story perfectly. But it had a huge support team around that one tiny sensor. So anyone says that in the comments, there's always a caveat when people say they use phones to make a feature film. Look at the supporting equipment around in post-production and on set, around that small phone sensor that was used. All right, guys, I'm Maty Young. Thanks for listening to this one, and I'll see you next time. Bye.